Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something fundamental, our planet Earth, this vibrant living sphere. And what makes it all possible really are three key things. Its atmosphere, energy from the sun, and of course water. Lots of water. These aren't just background features, they're essential for life. But here's the tricky part, the paradox. As our technology and population have grown, we've put enormous stress on the very environment that supports us. Yet it's that same technology that also gives us the tools to understand and, well, hopefully manage these impacts better.
That's exactly right. And chemistry, interestingly, is right at the center of almost all these environmental questions. Think about it. Water treatment, getting energy from fossil fuels. Chemical processes are everywhere in modern life. But many of these processes, or maybe their byproducts, can be harmful. The real trick is seeing the impacts that aren't immediately obvious, the subtle stuff. You really need to understand the chemistry underneath.
Right. And that's what we're aiming for in this deep dive. We're going to unpack the chemistry of the environment, drawing heavily from that key text, chemistry, the central science. We'll look at the atmosphere, water's role, and then dive into something called green chemistry, which is quite hopeful, our goal, to get you quickly up to speed on these vital topics, connecting the chemistry to the real world. Okay, let's get into it. First up, Earth's protective blanket, the atmosphere. It's way more than just the air we happen to breathe. It's layered. Scientists split it into 4 regions based on temperature changes as you go up. Down here, where we are, that's the troposphere. All our weather happens there. Then above that, maybe 10 up to 50 kilometers, is the stratosphere. And weirdly, the temperature actually goes up there. Then you have the mesosphere and the thermosphere way up high. And these layers, they sort of slow down how gases mix between them.
Yeah, and it's crucial to get how much the pressure drops as you go higher. It falls off really, really fast near the surface because air is compressible. Most of the atmosphere's actual mass is packed into the troposphere and stratosphere. And if you look at dry air near sea level, what's it made of? Mostly nitrogen, about 78%, and oxygen, around 21%. So like 99% is just those two gases. Everything else, CO2, argon, other trace gases, is in that last 1%.
And for those trace gases, the ones that have big environmental roles, we often use parts per million, the ppm. It helps grasp tiny concentration. So CO2 is at, say, 400 ppm. That's 400 molecules of CO2 for every million molecules of air. Tiny fraction. Huge impact sometimes.
Absolutely. And thinking about nitrogen and oxygen chemically, they're worlds apart. Nitrogen, N2, has this incredibly strong triple bond. It's very stable, doesn't react easily. Oxygen, O2, though, weaker double bond, much more reactive. It loves forming oxides. This difference is fundamental to atmospheric chemistry.
Which leads us straight to the upper atmosphere, Earth's first shield against solar radiation. The sun sends out some nasty high-energy UV light. But up there, a process called photodissociation happens. Basically, light breaks molecules apart. Can you walk us through that with oxygen?
Sure, it's like a natural sunscreen. High up, O2 molecules absorb that high-energy UV. Bang! The molecule splits into 2 separate oxygen atoms, just O. This absorbs a lot of the really damaging short-wavelength UV before it reaches us. Nitrogen, with its super strong bond, much harder to break apart like that, so you don't get much atomic nitrogen. And besides breaking bonds, there's also photoionization. A photon shits a molecule hard enough to knock an electron right off, creating a positive ion. Both these processes, photodissociation and photoionization, are vital. They soak up that high-energy radiation. Life really couldn't exist without them.
Okay, but even with those, there's another really crucial player, right? Stratospheric ozone, O3. The ozone shield. It mocks up UV radiation that O2 doesn't quite catch. How does that shield work? Is it static?
Oh, not at all. It's a constant cycle. You get atomic oxygen, O, from O2 breaking apart. That O bumps into an O2 molecule, and with a third molecule, usually N2 or O2, acting as a helper to carry away energy, they form ozone, O3. And this releases heat. Then, an ozone molecule can absorb a different UV photon, break back down into O2 and O. This cycle, O to O3 and back to O, is constantly happening. It converts UV energy into heat. That's why the stratosphere warms up as you go higher. The actual concentration of ozone peaks lower down, around 25 kilometers. That's what we call the ozone layer. It's this dynamic process that protects us.
Which brings us, unfortunately, to how human activities have messed with that balance. Ozone depletion.
Yeah, the discovery of the Antarctic ozone hole in 1985 was a massive shock. And the Nobel Prize later went to Roland, Molina, and Pretzen for figuring out that human-made chemicals, specifically chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, were the culprits.
Right, CFCs. Used in old aerosol cans, refrigerators. They seemed perfect initially. Totally unreactive, didn't dissolve in water down here. But that inertness meant they didn't get broken down or washed out. They just floated up, slowly but surely into the stratosphere.
And up there, the environment is different. Intense UV radiation. That UV light can break down CFCs. When they break, they release chlorine atoms. And chlorine atoms are incredibly effective at destroying ozone. It's a catalytic cycle. One chlorine atom reacts with ozone, forms chlorine monoxide, ClO. Then the ClO reacts further, releasing the chlorine atom again, ready to destroy another ozone molecule. So a single chlorine atom can take out thousands, even tens of thousands of ozone molecules, a chain reaction.
Wow. But the world did react, didn't it? The Montreal Protocol in 1987, that banned CFC production, a huge international agreement. It showed we can tackle global environmental problems even if it takes time.
Exactly. It was a landmark success. CFC levels have dropped significantly. But because these molecules last so long and diffuse slowly, it'll still take decades for the ozone layer to fully recover to pre-1980 levels.
So what did we replace CFCs with? And did that solve everything?
Well, the main replacements were hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. They don't have chlorine, so they don't attack the ozone layer. That's the good news. The bad news, HFCs are unfortunately very potent greenhouse gases. Some are thousands of times more powerful than CO2 at trapping heat, and their concentration in the atmosphere has been climbing fast, so we swapped one problem for another, in a way.
Okay, let's shift gears. Another big air issue. Acid rain. There are natural sources, volcanoes and stuff, but human activity, mostly burning fossil fuels, especially coal, dumps about 80 trillion grams of sulfur compounds into the air every year. Way more than nature does.
And the chemistry is pretty direct. Sulfur dioxide, SO2, from burning coal gets oxidized in the air to sulfur trioxide, SO3. Then SO3 dissolves in water droplets, forming sulfuric acid, H2SO4. Nitrogen oxides, NaHNOx, from engines also contribute, forming nitric acid. Normal rain is slightly acidic, maybe pH 5.6 because of CO2. Acid rain can be pH 4 or even lower, much more corrosive.
And the damage is real. Acid rain harms lakes, kills fish, affects entire ecosystems. Plus, it eats away at buildings and statues, especially marble and limestone. Costs billions every year.
There are ways to reduce SO2 emissions, thankfully, like injecting powdered limestone into power plant furnaces. The limestone reacts with SO2, capturing it as a solid waste product. It helps, though it doesn't eliminate the problem entirely.
All right, another one. Photochemical smog, that hazy stuff you see over cities, especially on still sunny days. It starts with nitric oxide, NO, formed in hot car engines. NO quickly turns into nitrogen dioxide, NO2, in the air. And the key step for smog is sunlight hitting that NO2. It breaks it down into NO and a single oxygen atom, O.
Yes, and this atomic oxygen is highly reactive. It immediately combines with an O2 molecule to form ozone, O3. But this is ozone down here in the troposphere, where we live. That's the crucial point. Ozone in the stratosphere protects us, but ozone down here, it's a pollutant. It's toxic, irritates lungs, damages plants. It's a major component of smog and bad for health. So we have this weird situation. Not enough good ozone up high, too much bad ozone down low.
Right. Unburned gasoline fumes also play a role in smog formation, though catalytic converters in cars have helped reduce those significantly.
Okay, let's broaden the scope now to the greenhouse effect and climate change. Our atmosphere naturally traps some heat, which is good. It keeps Earth habitable. Gases like water vapor and carbon dioxide absorb infrared radiation coming off the Earth's surface, preventing it all from escaping into space, like the glass roof of a greenhouse.
Water vapor is actually the biggest player in this natural effect. You feel its absence in deserts, super hot days, then freezing nights because there's little water vapor to hold the heat. But CO2 is the one we've dramatically altered. Burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas releases enormous amounts. We're talking something like 2.2 times 10 to the 16th grams of CO2 every year.
And we know this is changing things. Ice cores drilled in Antarctica and Greenland trap ancient air bubbles. They show us CO2 levels were pretty stable for thousands of years. Then, around the Industrial Revolution, they started climbing sharply. We're now up about 30%, maybe more, to around 400 ppm, levels the Earth hasn't seen in millions of years. The scientific consensus is overwhelming. This extra CO2 is trapping more heat, leading to an increase in the global average temperature. That's why we often say climate change now, not just global warming. It's not just about temperature. It affects rainfall, sea levels, storm intensity, the whole climate system.
And CO2 isn't the only culprit, right? There are other greenhouse gases.
Definitely. We already mentioned HFCs, potent and increasing fast. Methane, CH4, is another big one. Molecule for molecule, methane traps about 21 times more heat than CO2 over certain timescales. It comes from agriculture, rice paddies, livestock from extracting fossil fuels, and natural sources like swamps and termites. About 2/3 of current emissions are human-related, and they're also going up. Reducing methane is another key area.
Let's switch now to water, The blue planet. Absolutely vital for life. All the water on Earth is connected through the global water cycle. Evaporation, condensation, rain, snow, melting ice. It's constantly moving. And these changes in state, like evaporation and condensation, they don't just move water, they move huge amounts of heat around the planet too.
It's incredible. The oceans hold something like 97.2% of all Earth's water. Vast. And it's salty, of course. Average salinity is about 3.5% dissolved salts, mostly chloride and sodium ions like table salt, but also sulfate, magnesium, calcium. Only a few things like common salt, magnesium, and bromine are actually extracted commercially, though, because desalination is expensive.
And here's another link back to the atmosphere. Ocean acidification. Just like the atmosphere, the ocean is absorbing a lot of that extra CO2 we're pumping out. When CO2 dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid, H2CO3, and that lowers the ocean's pH, making it more acidic.
Right. And the critical problem there is that increased acidity reduces the concentration of carbonate ions, CO32. Many marine organisms, corals, shellfish, plankton, need those carbonate ions to build their shells and skeletons, which are made of calcium carbonate, KCO3. More acidic water makes it harder for them to build shells and can even start dissolving existing ones. This threatens entire marine food webs from the bottom up. It's a huge concern.
Wow. So while the ocean is huge, fresh water is actually incredibly rare. Only about 0.6% of all water on Earth makes it super precious. It mainly comes from precipitation, runs over land, dissolves minerals, collects in rivers, lakes.
And a lot of it seeps underground into groundwater, stored in porous rock layers called aquifers. About 20% of fresh water is down there, but its quality depends on the rock it flows through. Sometimes, like in parts of Bangladesh and elsewhere, groundwater naturally picks up high levels of arsenic, which is toxic, a major public health issue.
Which leads us to protecting our water sources. Human impact here is massive. Billions of tons of plastic waste end up in the oceans, and lots of wastewater, sewage, industrial stuff just gets dumped without treatment.
A key measure of water quality is dissolved oxygen, DO. Fish need it to breathe. But things like sewage are oxygen-demanding wastes. Bacteria decompose them, but use up DO in the process. If the DO drops too low, the aerobic bacteria die off. Then anaerobic bacteria take over, producing nasty stuff like hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smell. The water becomes unhealthy, basically dead.
And it connects to nutrients too, right? Like eutrophication. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus, mainly from sewage and farm runoff, act like fertilizer in the water. They cause huge blooms of algae. But when all that algae dies, its decomposition consumes massive amounts of oxygen, depleting DO and creating dead zones where fish and other animals can't survive. We see this in the Gulf of Mexico, for example.
So cleaning water is essential. For salty ocean water, we need desalination. Distillation works, boil water, condense the steam, but uses a ton of energy. Reverse osmosis is more common now. You use high pressure to force water through a special membrane that blocks the salt ions. Saudi Arabia has the world's largest plant using this method.
And for the fresh water, we use in towns and cities. Municipal water treatment. It's usually a multi-step process. First, screening out big stuff. Then sedimentation, letting solids settle out, maybe adding chemicals like aluminum sulfate to help clump particles together, then filtering through sand beds, bit an aeration, bubbling air through to oxidize things like iron and manganese and get rid of smelly gases. And finally, the really critical step, disinfection, killing harmful bacteria and viruses.
Yes, and that's usually done with chlorine. It's cheap, effective, and has saved countless lives by preventing waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid. But there's a downside. Chlorine can react with dissolved organic matter in the water to form compounds called trihalomethanes, THMs. And some THMs are suspected carcinogens. So it's a trade-off. The huge benefit of killing deadly pathogens versus the potential long-term risk of disinfection byproducts. Alternatives like ozone or chlorine dioxide are used sometimes, but they can form other potentially harmful byproducts like bromate. It's a complex challenge finding the perfect balance.
On a smaller scale, things like the life straw offer point-of-use purification, really important in emergencies or places without clean water infrastructure.
And just briefly circling back to energy, something like fracking, hydraulic fracturing, has boosted oil and gas production massively.
Yeah.
But it raises serious water quality concerns. The large volumes of chemical-laced water used, potential groundwater contamination, and methane leaks. It really highlights the conflict between energy demand and environmental protection.
So after looking at all these challenges, let's end on a more hopeful note. Green chemistry. This is about fundamentally rethinking how we do chemistry, designing products and processes that are safer, cleaner, and more sustainable from the start. It acknowledges Earth is basically a closed system. Waste doesn't just disappear.
Exactly. It's not just about cleaning up pollution after the fact, but preventing it in the first place. There are 12 core principles guiding green chemistry. Things like preventing waste is better than treating it, maximizing atom economy, so most of your starting materials end up in the final product, not as waste, designing safer chemicals, using safer solvents, being energy efficient, using renewable resources instead of fossil fuels, and designing products that degrade safely when they're done with.
And we're seeing real-world examples, like making styrene, a key plastic component. The old way used toxic benzene in multiple steps. A greener process now uses less toxic starting materials, like toluene, potentially from biomass, in a single, more energy-efficient step. Less waste, less energy, less hazard.
Or using supercritical solvents. Carbon dioxide, under high pressure and temperature, becomes supercritical, sort of like a liquid and gas hybrid. It's a great non-toxic solvent. It's used now in things like decaffeinating coffee and even making Teflon, replacing harmful solvents. And the CO2 can be captured and reused, so it's not adding net CO2 to the atmosphere for that process.
And better atom economy, too, like an improved process for making hydroquinone, a photographic developer that recycles its byproducts. Much less waste. Or these amazing click reactions chemists have developed. They're incredibly efficient, almost 100% yield, creating complex molecules with virtually no waste. It's really elegant chemistry. So we've covered a lot, from the atmosphere's layers and the water cycle, to ozone holes, acid rain, climate change, water pollution, and finally, to these innovative green chemistry approaches aiming for a more sustainable future.
And understanding the chemistry behind all this, it's not just for scientists. It helps all of us make more informed choices, as consumers, as citizens. This knowledge lets you connect the dots between everyday life and the environment. You start to see the chemistry everywhere.
So, thinking about everything we've unpacked today, drawing from chemistry, the central science, what stands out for you? Is there a chemical interaction, maybe something about ozone, or perhaps a green chemistry innovation that you'll see differently now? What's maybe one small thing you could change or think about, armed with a bit more chemical insight for a healthier planet? Something to consider. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you feel more well-informed and maybe even inspired to look deeper into these crucial topics.